My dear ones, I am Father Fabio Marinho, and today we celebrate the 27th Sunday in Ordinary Time. I have a request. It is the compass of this Sunday's liturgy. Lord, increase our faith. Doesn't this request arise in a vacuum? In the previous verse of this Gospel of Luke, in chapter 17, Jesus teaches about unlimited forgiveness. He says, "If your brother sins against you 7 times a day, and 7 times comes to you saying, 'I repent,' you will forgive him." In other words, the request for increased faith is a response to the ethical and spiritual challenge of constant forgiveness. The disciples intuit that forgiving repeatedly requires much more than willpower. It requires faith. Faith is not an abstract belief, but living trust in the transforming power of God acting in human relationships. Hermeneutically, this request echoes the prayers of the righteous in the Old Testament. As the books of Psalms and the prophet Habakkuk already said, "Lord, increase our strength, sustain our hearts." Read Psalm 51 in the first chapter, Jacob. Faith appears as both a gift and a task. A gift received and a task performed. In a psychoanalytic reading, this request reveals subjective insufficiency. Faced with the reality of forgiveness, I explain. The subject knows that he does not own the capacity to love and recognizes his helplessness, a rare moment of psychic truth. I can't do it alone. Here, the apostolic discourse breaks with the narcissism of, "I can handle it," and the otherness of God opens up, "I can't do it alone anymore." Jesus responds with an image, and he says to the disciples, "A tiny grain. Is it capable of doing the impossible?" Uprooting a mulberry tree, because the mulberry tree has very deep roots. That's why he uses the symbol of the mulberry tree. Because besides having deep roots, he will also say, "Uproot it and plant it in the sea." And the sea in the biblical text will always be the symbol of chaos, of a deliberate and uncontrollable movement. Whenever the sea is mentioned in the gospel, remember that it symbolizes chaos. This image that Jesus uses, both of the mustard seed and the mulberry tree with deep roots, is hyperbolic, as was common in prophetic language at the time, exaggerated, but carries a very great spiritual key. Pay attention. The mustard seed represents faith in its initial stage, not grandiose, but real as we all go through. It is not the quantity of faith that moves us, but in its authenticity and connection with the divine, with God. The mulberry tree, with its deep roots, symbolizes deep-rooted sins, old hurts, structures that are rigid, that which is rooted in resentment and mango. The sea, as already mentioned in biblical symbolism, represents that primordial chaos. Remember that place where God manifested power? In the book of Genesis, in the first chapter, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. The earth was formless, that is, it had no form. The form was chaotic, the opposite of chaos. The cosmos is what is perfect, what is in total harmony. Thus, faith, even small, has the power to uproot. It is not what seemed definitive, and cast into chaos that which no longer serves. In spiritual hermeneutics, faith is the power to displace what is crystallized. In psychoanalytic hermeneutics, it is a symbolic act that allows us to traverse enjoyment, fix pleasure, and open a space for the new. The second part of the gospel seems very harsh at first glance. Jesus speaks of a servant who, after working, still serves at the table without expecting thanks. And here's the crux. True faith manifests itself in free service, without expecting anything in return or recognition from the South. In Semitic culture, that is, the ancient peoples, Jesus uses domestic logic to speak of the relationship with God. He will say, "No one thanks a servant for doing what is a servant's obligation." Similarly, making an analogy, authentic faith does not become a bargaining chip with God. As many think, "I did it right away, I deserve it." A disciple is not an employee who demands a spiritual salary. A disciple is a servant who participates in a much greater mission. From the point of view of hermeneutical biblical interpretation, isn't Jesus devaluing the disciple? He is purifying the intention of faith. Mature faith is silent service. It is not a pious spectacle. Gratuity is at the heart of Christian spirituality. Matthew in chapter 10 tells us, "Freely you have received, freely you shall give." From a psychoanalytic point of view, this passage unmasks the fantasy of narcissistic recognition and often inhabits our relationship with God and others. I want to be seen. I want to be thanked. I want to be validated. Or why not say, I want to receive likes. I want to come and pet. Jesus shifts this fantasy to the position of a servant, one who acts for meaning and not for reward. Notice the structure of the gospel text. First, the disciples ask for faith. Then, Jesus shows that little authentic faith is effective. Third, Jesus teaches that authentic faith leads to free, humble service. Faith begins with asking, passes through active trust, and ends in self-emptying. A path that recalls a letter to Philippians in chapter 2, we were Paul. Money on the internet. I also don't know if you know what the letter to the Philippians reminds us of in chapter 2, when Paul recites their Christological hymn of the emptying of Jesus. Even though he was, God assumed the condition of a slave. This is what we call kenosis in Greek. Kenosis. Faith does not grow by accumulating certainty. Faith grows by decentralizing the ego. In today's world, there is a double temptation. On the one hand, we try to reduce faith to religious discourse without real effectiveness on the roots of inner and social evil. On the other hand, we can instrumentalize faith for effective bargaining, for religious and even political bargaining, as if God were a manager of our will. Luke, in the Gospel, invites us to another path. Ask for faith as a gift, exercise it in small things with great confidence, and live this faith in a servile attitude without expecting applause, recognition, likes. In the age of the internet, there are many who call themselves Catholics who love to make inflammatory, moralistic speeches just to be applauded. For whom do they live the same reality? Of a false moralism, of judgment, ruthless before others. Faith is an inner movement. From the inside out, it is a movement that uproots the mulberry tree of resentment. Faith uproots the mulberry tree of the anguish of oppression and plants old hurts in the sea, and put on your apron to serve. Even tired because you love St. Augustine, you will say in your treatise on the Gospel of John, faith is the beginning of human life in God. It believes in order to understand and understands in order to believe even more deeply. A psychoanalytic reading of this passage from the Gospel reveals the subject's journey toward the decentralization of the ego. The apostles' request increases our faith. Lord, this request is in itself a gesture of recognition of structural helplessness, what Freud calls the original condition of non-self-sufficiency. I can't be alone anymore. The disciples, when asking for faith, abandon the imaginary position of, I can handle it. You can leave it to me, because I place myself in a symbolic place, the place of those who need otherness to exist. The mustard seed represents a small fissure in narcissism, which allows the other's word to enter. It tears from us the feeling of exclusivity. It is at this minimal, apparently fragile point of seed that the possibility of displacing rigid structures opens up. Those brambles with deep roots and rooted in our unconscious. Resentments crystallize 12. Repetitive patterns, unconscious guilt, alienating identifications. Repressions. Faith that functions as a symbolic act of trust in the other that founds a subject, allowing one to rewrite one's history from a new position until now. My enjoyment, my joy was validated, and enjoyment cannot be enjoyed. Pleasure cannot be, it says, zeroed. What has been lived is already an experience. It is already within us. If we understand that it is necessary to change, we will not erase what has been lived. We will start a different story from here. When Jesus speaks of the servant who serves without expecting thanks, he touches on the core of the narcissistic fantasies of recognition. In times of the internet, there are many little Christians who want to be applauded, with moralistic speeches, with speeches that say a lot about themselves. These people's audience is a sick audience. We follow, usually those with parents, we identify ourselves in our unconscious. The subject, when serving, often unconsciously seeks to be loved, to be seen, to be validated. That's why, no, we hardly find so many. Influencers, vomiting rules, vomiting laws, commandments, codes, just for service, just to be validated. Jesus subverts this logic, inviting an action descentator from the ego, where desire is no longer fixed on the approval of the imaginary other, because we don't even know what you there on the other side will think about the material we deliver to you. But this approval of the imaginary other, where desire is no longer fixed, it shows that desire is in the word that gives meaning to the act itself. Let me explain. Authentic faith is not a childish belief, no instrument of magical power over reality. Authentic faith. In psychoanalytic language, it is a crossing, a displacement, leaving the place of the subject from a narcissistic position to a position of symbolic openness, where the act, be it forgiving, serving, loving, or respecting, ceases to be a demand for recognition and becomes an expression of meaning. Many people on the internet today, especially those who claim to be very Catholic, need to learn this. Doing good and defending the good of the church needs to stop being a need for applause. Most people who post content about the church on social media today just want to be applauded. They want to increase their number of followers with a discourse that fits the needs of those on the other side of the screen. So, as we mature in our faith, the need for likes, applause, and likes becomes a dull dream. It disappears when authentic faith disappears. Faith does not resolve the unconscious, but it allows the unconscious to be traversed with confidence, opening space for the subject to stop compulsively repeating the same things, the same speech, the same tone of voice, the same attacks, the tantrums. And this subject begins to act symbolically. Therefore, today's word calls us, dear ones, there is a double movement. The first movement is a movement of disarming the ego, recognizing your own insufficiency, and opening cracks in this narcissism of yours, which makes you think you are very good, irreproachable, and that everyone wants to copy you, that everyone thinks you are wonderful nonsense. Secondly, serving from the symbolic and not from the imaginary, acting by meaning, not for applause and recognition, acting by conviction and not to seal. In faith, the subject stops trying to control the other and begins to inhabit a symbolic relationship with the mystery. It is in this place, dear ones, that the mulberry tree can finally be uprooted and thrown into the sea.